It's Saturday, September 7th, 1940, and for the past year, the British Empire has been in a hellish situation in Western Europe, doing everything in its power to stop the quickly progressing killing machine that has become Nazi Germany. Since Germany's invasion into Poland almost exactly 1 year prior, the British, along with her European allies, mainly France, would declare war with the prospect of ending this war sooner rather than later. But quickly, the Nazis would gain the upper hand. By May of 1940, the Germans had began their conquest through France. The Nazis were taking on arguably one of the greatest and most historied armies to ever exist. Right? The French, in biblical terms, are a Goliath with an undeniable genius of military leaders. In their pedigree, they've got men such as Napoleon and us Americans who know Marquis de Lafayette. The French mobilized and created one of the largest standing armies in the world with over 3 million men ready to defend their homeland. But once the Nazis struck, it would take only 6 weeks for one of the greatest militaries to exist to fall. Now England is alone on this side of the Atlantic. In the fall of 1940, the British were preparing the defense of their homeland. Nuisance bombers had been hitting and started plucking the city with some of the military bases around, but it appears the Royal Air Force is giving up a much harder fight than the Germans had expected. This is the Battle of Britain, and so far, so good. However, on this fateful Saturday in September, the untouched city of London and its inhabitants could hear the drowned out humming from the distance. 348 bombers are being escorted by over 600 fighters, and they were hurtling across the English Channel and heading straight for London. This was just one piece in a 9-month campaign against the United Kingdom. Welcome to our newest series, The Last Man Standing in 1940. Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. And in our newest series that we're going to begin today will lead up to the battle and immediately after the Battle of Britain. We're going to be covering an immense amount of information in this series as well. And there's so much more to this moment in World War II than just the Battle of Britain and the continual bombing of London, which we will all learn is the Blitz. In this first episode, we're going to cover basically what the British were doing within the year gap from the invasion of Poland. We're going to cover some of the ground before that. And then we're going to move past. We're going to go to the official declaration of war between the Western Allied forces and the Nazis, all the way up to a year following when the Luftwaffe brought the war to the British doorsteps. We're going to be pulling in all sorts of perspectives. It's probably going to appear that we're skipping over maybe some information, especially in the front. I'm just going to give us a real quick, down and dirty of how we got here, what the British are doing, and how the British responded when it came to the Battle of Britain. So, right, if you know anything about World War II and dates that are involved with it, then you have most certainly heard of September 1st, 1939. Why? Well, that was the day that most historians will agree was the official beginning of the Second World War. This was all kicked off by the Nazis and the Soviet Union, basically going full send into the east and invading Poland for the Soviet Union. Obviously, it would be their west, but we're focusing on the Nazis here. Let's ask the question again, right? So why does this matter? Well, situationally in the 1930s, Europe is still very, very much recovering from the then bloodiest war in human history, that being the First World War. Many nations had not only suffered an incredible large amount of physical damage, to include for a lack of better term, a butcher's bill for every nation at the end of the war. But more so, many nations faced dire economical situations that were only elevated to catastrophic levels with the collapse of the global stock market exchange in the 1920s following the end of the war. Of course, the main nation that we think of when we speak of disparity would be that now of the Weimar Republic, which took power in Germany after the fall of the Kaiser and the German Empire. The Treaty of Versailles had quite literally put a noose around the neck of the German people at this time. Now, if we think about what I mean when I say that, let me just hit you with some super fast bullet points on what the treaty did to the Germans. First and foremost, they made the Germans accept total responsibility for the war, right? It was their fault. They're taking blame for it. And people will argue that, well, Archduke Ferdinand, he was killed by the Serbs. What, we're not getting into the World War II podcast. That's just the Treaty of Versailles. It then brought about, for the most part, vanquishing, totally de-arming their military down to a minuscule force, only for home defense. More or less, the army was shrunk to, I believe, and I could be wrong here, it was 100,000. In the sense of a military that is quite small, if that's your nation's defending force. Not only that, but the bill that they were handed for reparations was suffocating. When originally written, they gave the Germans a bill of 269 billion gold marks. Now, this number would be slashed in half by in 1929 stock market crash, and it would be dropped down to 130 billion. Which is still absurd. For those of you going, well, when did they pay it off? They made their final payment in 2010. So 14 years ago. By the time humanity's arch nemesis, Adolf Hitler, begins his ascension to power in 1933, Europe is only separated from the end of World War I by less than 20 years, and they are at the back end of one of the largest global economic crises, right? Crises. This is not good, right? This, in no situation for anyone is this good. So because of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany is not allowed to have a standing military, and they're not allowed to have a standing air force as well. They are also not allowed to produce weapons for war. Interesting, right? Yet, if there is anything we know about the precursor to World War II, it is that Hitler did a fantastic job of basically saying to hell with all of those rules, and how is Germany supposed to defend herself with no real military, and begins to, how should we say, he begins to become a rule breaker. Now, it's important to note that, yes, he was always a rule breaker. He went to prison. He wrote Mein Kampf in prison. But now he's beginning to break the rules in broad daylight. That's what we're going to say. Rumors began to circulate in 1933 that the Nazis are, in fact, breaking the treaty and forming an air force. And those rumors were right. They absolutely were. On March 15th, 1933, the Luftwaffe is officially created in total secrecy, and the slow buildup begins. In October of that same year, Germany leaves the League of Nations due to the fact that they will not allow Germany to arm itself. That's not a sign. I do not know what is. Germany is making it very clear that it not only wants to rearm itself, but it's going to, no matter what anyone else has to say. So fast forward to 34, and it's no better. Germany signs a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland. Ironic. But then something happens in June of 34, and that would be that the Western Allies sends the Western Allies into a tailspin of fear. On the 30th of June, prominent German leaders are the direct target of destruction and murder at the hands of the Nazi Party in a day that we all know as the Night of Long Knives. This is kind of the SA's rise to power, right? Heinrich Himmler, it's kind of his push, right? It's a purge is exactly what it is. In 1935, the Germans living in the Saar region, which is formerly of the German Empire but was lost as part of the Treaty of Versailles, held a plebiscite to rejoin Germany, and 90% would vote to rejoin their home nation. Well, let's take a real fast pause just to get a gauge of what is happening in Europe, mainly Germany. They are secretly rebuilding their military. They sign a non-aggression pact with another nation. Former states that were lost as a result of World War I are now being revoted back into Germany. And on top of all of that, Germany literally just purged its government. France and Britain at this point are beyond high alert, and they are scrambling to prevent anything further. In order to hopefully stop this newfound fascination of disobeying the Treaty of Versailles, the United Kingdom agrees to allow the Germans to rebuild their navy. However, it could only be 35% of the total tonnage of the Royal Navy. This was more damage than good, and let me tell you exactly why. England did not consult with the French, who is a neighboring country of the nation that they have just given the green light to build. This petrified the French government, and also it pissed them off because they felt it would only benefit the British no matter what. So now we have Hitler allowed to rebuild his navy, and the two biggest superpowers in Europe are now butting heads over said decision. Now, I do want to backtrack just for a moment, right? So in 1934, the League of Nations more or less ran a census known as the Peace Ballot on how England felt about their own rearmament. It was basically a 10-1 on the hell no, we're not going to repeat the same exact thing we did 20 years ago, and I don't care what this guy in Germany's doing. Ironically, Lord Stanley Baldwin, who is the president of the council, begins coming up with ideas to beef up the forces anyway. The RAF was to expand by 40 squadrons in the next 5 years, but it would be accelerated to 2 years because they were quickly being outpaced by the Luftwaffe. Together with a friend of his, Winston Churchill, they would make a press to get their Air Force ready and make the largest Air Force that the world had ever seen. Not only that, they had also expanded their Navy even further. They even refit all of the Army. But this is all not without opposition. Some members within Parliament, such as Clement Attlee, believed that England needed to keep their nose out of this, and that the British people clearly did not want it any other way. It was Attlee who believed that Hitler openly admitted in May of 1935 that he was breaking the treaty to build the Luftwaffe and that it was no threat to the peace of Europe. So yeah, the United Kingdom is pretty damn undecided on this whole matter taking place on the mainland. It was during this silent rearmament where Churchill would gain his favorship view of leading the nation once the war had in fact kicked off. But we're going to get back to that a little later. I just wanted to put it into perspective that England was not just idly standing by. They were seriously getting their military ready for the impending war they knew was going to happen. Anyway, by September, the Nuremberg laws are passed, which is the enabling of discrimination against Jews in Germany. And it is this moment right here where the stage is being set. Right now, there's a quite a bit that takes place from the fall of 35 to the fall of 40. That 5-year gap, there's a ton that takes place. In November of 1935, which becomes the last election that England would have for 10 years, Lord Stanley Baldwin becomes the prime minister. On January 20th, 1936, King George V dies. Great. Heading into a war, and the head of your nation dies. So in 3 months, right, the two highest powers in the United Kingdom have changed. On March 7th, Germany remilitarizes the Rhineland in a complete screw you. That's what we're going to say. A screw you move to the Western Allies. Now, looking back as a historian on this, I firmly believe that this is a moment that finalized the idea to Hitler that he could actually make all of this work. Hitler sent 20,000 Wehrmacht soldiers into the Rhineland and armed. By textbook definition, this is an invasion. Right? No matter if it was previously their land or whatever, it's an invasion. And it was a clear and deliberate aggressive act by Germany. But France and England were horrified of the thought of another war. You got to remember that the First World War was not really an experience that anyone was wanting to go through again, and certainly not this fast. We're still within 20 years. So King Edward VIII tells Baldwin to stand down their military and to let Germany do their thing. It is at this point where Hitler realizes, hey, no one's going to interfere any longer with my ideas. He can do whatever he wants. And the Western Allies had just proved to him that they are not going to do anything. However, a war would find Europe faster than Hitler could start one. And in July of 1936, a coup in Spain would kick off their civil war. This is where Hitler's military leaders would go and gain a vast amount of experience. And what's even more ironic is once again, England stayed away. Not because they didn't want to step on Hitler's toes, but because they believed both sides were kind of awful. One side was being helped by the fascists, and that was the side that Adolf Hitler was helping. And then the other side was being helped by the communists. So England's not on board with either side. They kind of take a neutrality side into it. So to England, they were just going to be a bystander on this one. All the while, the Luftwaffe is getting in practice for what is to come. In October, Hermann Göring is named the head of Germany's 4-year plan. For those of you that have no idea what the 4-year plan is, well, it was everything the Treaty of Versailles and the Western Allies had been saying not to do. Germany's focus with this plan was to really do two things, right? So one, it's going to completely rearm their military. Two, it would take Germany from its crippled economic state and make it completely self-sufficient by 1940. The British knew that this was another clear violation of the treaty, yet they believed by this point it was dangerously critical that Germany was in fact preparing for war and not home defense. Even the former Prime Minister, David George, said that Hitler had reached the point of inviolability. By the end of 1936, Germany's closest ally, which would be fascist Italy, puts boots on the ground in Spain during the Civil War. Because of this, the League of Nations once again reconvenes, and the Non-Intervention Committee bars any international intervention in Spain. Prime Minister Baldwin would go as far as to halt global exports heading to Spain. We're going to circle back around on this little committee in a few minutes, as this is not a done deal up front. It would take more or less all the way up to the official beginning of World War II for any of it to be truly fully ironed out. But then in December, once again, the United Kingdom would go through another change of power. King Edward VIII was faced with a personal predicament of falling in love or remain a king. Long story short, the Church of England would not allow him to marry his wife due to the fact that she had been married before. We will not elaborate on that any further. If you want to, go watch The Crown. So within the same year he was coronated as the King of England, he abdicated the throne and his brother became King George VI on December 11th, 1936. But that is not the only issue that this brings. Because of the abdication, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin retires in May of 1937, and Neville Chamberlain is swiftly brought in to be Prime Minister. But let's all pull this back in, as it is now summer of 1937. And the Condor Legion, which is the Wehrmacht's Air Corps, that's a good way to put it. It's the air wing of the German army. They officially joined the fight in Spain. So Hitler does not care at all with what the League of Nations is saying, right? So this committee that we were talking about, they could never agree on anything because it impacted all of Europe. It wasn't just like we're just not going to go there. We're not going to help. We're just going to stay completely out of it. These are intertwined countries, economically, politically, humanitarianly. They're all intertwined. So it was always one more thing every time. So Hitler, by this point, is just like, you guys can't figure out your own mind. I'm going to figure it out for you. And I'm just going to go ahead and send the Condor Legion there. While all of this is taking place, the Empire of Japan is well at war with China. The situation in the Pacific is red hot, and it is not good. So this is not looking good for anybody. The United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt makes a move away from neutrality at this time and towards cutting off global aggressors. The foundation for a global conflict is quickly being finished, and within the following year, the stage is almost going to be totally set. On March 13th, 1938, Germany forces the hand of Austria, which is Hitler's home country, to not just join Germany, but they're going to be annexed by him. Now, this was not of course, a happy-go-lucky, we're just going to join your country. Almost immediately, thousands of Austrians would be rounded up and arrested. Prime Minister Chamberlain would hold a meeting the following morning in the House of Commons where it was decided that this would not hold any major impact on the UK's European policy, right? They just annexed another country. We're still just gonna stay in our lane. So, just like the Saar region, in a way, the Western Allies, I hate to say it, turning their back, but in a way, they turned their back on the advancement of Nazi Germany in Europe at this point. Now, we are getting ready to dive into the aggression that Adolf Hitler has been hiding away. So it is clear that by the summer of 1938, Nazi Germany is going to disregard the remainders of the Treaty of Versailles and just conquest through Europe. In September, Roosevelt sends a letter to Hitler begging for peace in Europe. 3 days later, on September 30th, leaders from the UK, France, Germany, and Italy meet in Munich, Germany to discuss peace before war breaks out. They finally reach an agreement, but it comes with some serious consequences. Hitler agrees to the peace in Europe, but with a few conditions. You see, Hitler hasn't quite reached the area where he's happy with the progress. In order for him to, we're going to say, chill out, England and France must be okay with the Germans taking back the Sudetenland, but also they must be allowed to annex Czechoslovakia. After some deep deliberation, it is agreed upon. Germany can have the two regions, but no more, and the threat is over. And in any act towards neighboring Poland would be considered an act of war, and they agree and sign it. And yes, for those of you who are wondering, this is the famous moment where Prime Minister Chamberlain steps off his plane in England, holding the signed Munich Agreement in the air and proclaiming something along the lines of peace of our time. For a large majority of Europe, and especially those in the United Kingdom, this is a huge sigh of relief. It is clear that war has been completely avoided. But then 2 months later, on November 7th, German consular aide Ernst von Rath is murdered by a Polish German Jew in the city of Paris, France. This would mark the official beginning to Hitler's reign of terror over European Jews. 2 days later, on the 9th of November, pogroms would begin. Jewish shops, religious centers, and community centers were robbed, burnt to the ground throughout Germany, and many German Jews would be wounded or, in some cases, murdered in cold blood at the hands of the Nazis. This night would go on to be known as the Night of Broken Glass or Kristallnacht. Peace of our time would last 2 short months. Almost immediately after, England would sever its government ties with Germany, and they would institute a program to allow easy passage of European Jewish children to escape the Nazi threat. In 1939, the tides had completely changed. In January, Hitler launches Plan Z, which has a sole purpose of turning the German Navy into the largest navy in the world, with one small goal in mind, and that was to totally destroy the Royal Navy. And on March 15th, Hitler breaks the Munich Agreement by invading Bohemia and Moravia. Now, that's like Czech Republic in today's terms. Anyway, once again, they just walk in and they take it. 6 days later, Hitler demands the return of Danzig, which the free city of Danzig, it's on the northern end of Poland. Poland claimed it at this time. Hitler wanted it back. We're in the same situation with the Sudetenland and the Saar region, right? It's the same situation. By the end of the month, England and France doubled down by telling Poland their independence is safe and that they will come to the rescue if invaded. This is not a if you're invaded, it's more of a, when you're going to get invaded, we'll come to your rescue. By 1939, England and France know that they are getting ready to go back to war over Europe. So much so that in April, Britain introduced peacetime conscription for the first time in its history. But you see, this wasn't the moment England realized war was coming sooner rather than later. By the end of 38 to the beginning of the war in 39, over 44 million gas masks had been given to the populace of England. The year prior, in 1937, the Air Raid Warden Services had been enacted to quite literally prepare the country for air raids. And it would be so used that the Women's Volunteer Service was added the following year, in 1938, to beef up the capabilities of the wardens. Right there, from 1937, they're already doing the preparations. Okay, well, here's what's going to happen in an air raid. Here's where we need to move. England had also become a mass producer of air raid shelters, and they were being built and implemented as early as 1938. People who didn't have access to these were prepared and trained to move into designated areas like little kids in a fire drill at school. England was not just preparing their military for war in the 1930s, they were preparing their people for war to come directly home to them. These steps and extra precautions the British took, especially Londoners, would prove to be an invaluable skill to have in 1940. Anyways, I'm getting all over the place. We're going to go back to the spring of 1939. On April 14th, Roosevelt once again sends a letter to Hitler attempting to find a resolution that results in peace. At the same time this is happening, the Soviet Union reaches out to the United Kingdom and France seeking a pact between the three nations. Due to the spiraling situation and the fact that the Soviet Union is communist, the two Western allies decline the offer. 10 days later, Hitler heads to the Reichstag and renounces the Anglo-German naval agreement. For those of you wondering why that may sound familiar, That was the treaty we talked about earlier that England made with Hitler that irritated the hell out of France. It didn't matter anyway because Hitler said to the hell with all these agreements and I'm going to do it my way. Seriously, one day later, Hitler renounces the German-Polish agreement of non-aggression, which means that Poland better get ready. Ironically enough, after renouncing the non-aggression agreement with Poland, Hitler attempts one with Norway, Finland, and Sweden, and they're all kind of like, dude, have you not broken every single one of these so far? I think we may pass on it. More ironically, he offers the same to Denmark, and they accept it. Spoiler alert, the Nazis invade Denmark in 1940. What I always find interesting here about the British home front is that, in a way, the United Kingdom begins to prepare their young men for war by enacting the Military Training Act on June 3rd. This meant that every single male aged 20 and 21 were ready to be called into active service immediately. Like, show up tomorrow. That's how this was going to work. So they implement the MTA on June 3rd. So now you've got groups of 20 to 21-year-old males that are at the drop of a hat in action military service. On July 10th, 1939, the British Prime Minister reaffirms to Poland that the request for Danzig goes against the Munich Agreement. Like, Hitler cares about that. And that England would intervene if Germany makes a move on it. So now it is confirmed by the British that they will, in fact, go to war over this. The Danzig crisis, in many ways, is the final proving point to Hitler that his uncontested expansion had come to an end. And the reality of it was his military that was preparing to take on the British was about to be put to the test. But the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23rd, 1939, would prove to be the nail in the coffin. Hitler no longer had to worry about the East once he invaded Poland, just the West. England and France quickly began preparing their nations for war, but they did not know that their time was already out and constrained to just a week. On September 1st, Germany would invade Poland, which would be followed by Neville Chamberlain's official declaration of war against the Germans 2 days later. So immediately following the invasion of Poland, England gets right to work. War Secretary Leslie Hoare-Belisha begins the mobilization of British armed forces. At the same exact time, the British know that Germany has no boundaries they are willing to test, and know that the Luftwaffe is a force to be reckoned with. Operation Pied Piper is launched, which is to relocate as many women and children, elderly, disabled, basically everyone that is not a male or a working class male. I think that's the best way to put it. Is the Operation Pied Piper? They're going to relocate all of them to the countrysides, away from major metropolitan areas, as the British are preparing for bombings. French and British ambassadors quickly demand that the German government ceases their invasion. That's obviously a joke to Hitler, and he no longer cares about anything these folks have to say to him. And from this point forward, the British are in total war mode. Full conscription is enacted, and all able-bodied men from the ages of 18 to 41 are called upon. France, on the other hand, waits and gives an ultimatum to Germany that goes unresponded to, thus forcing the hand of France, and they too declare war on Germany. It's not a long wait. This 2 days later, when England declares war, France says, hey, you have by 5 p.m., pull out your military, we won't declare war. They didn't. So it all happened in the same day, but they were a little delayed. In the same month the war begins, the British basically reprioritize their nation's supplies. Basic food rationing begins, and so does the use of petrol, or gas, in the United States. At the same time, a war tax is implemented, which raises their income taxes for every single person in the nation. And it is not just the country of England that's going to war. The entire population must brace for impact. Now, while yes, England and France openly stated that they would come to Poland's rescue if they were invaded, but Germany's simply too fast for them to react, and in just 35 days, Poland would fall to the hands of Nazi Germany. Now, I am not going to overly bore you with what takes place from October of 1939 to April of 1940 because it is literally, it's called the phony war for a reason. The war has finally kicked off and the battle lies their draw, but nothing takes place. There is one smallish offensive, if that's what you want to call it, in September of 1939, with all of the waiting around taking place. The French decide that it's better to reclaim certain areas before Germany could make a move west first. So on the 7th, the French launched an operation with the idea of driving the Germans out of the Saarland. The goal here was to tap the unsuspecting Germans on the Western Front, and they were in the middle of taking on the Poles, right? They would have zero reinforcement capabilities, allowing the French to regain control of the Saarland. However, quick math tells us this is 5 days too late. Oh, my mistake. This is October. October 7th is when they launched this. Okay. So it's 5 days too late, and Poland's already fell. By the time the French launch their operation, the Germans now have those capabilities to reinforce themselves, and they have the resources to beat the French back rather quickly. So the British and the French at this point are in quite the position. Not only are they having to prepare their militaries for war, but they also have to prepare their cities for war. It is a double-edged sword for both nations because now more than ever, they are needing to turn their factories that can supply not just their armies, but their population as well. It is at this time that England and France both turned to the United States and begun. Basically, they start going all out. They're ordering the whole deal, right? They're the house and the kitchen sink en masse. Thus, by doing so, this kicks off the Battle of the Atlantic with the whole German U-boats hunting down these transport ships and sinking them. By doing so, this places the Western Allies in a damn near spiral that can only end in disaster. And by early 1940, British troops and French troops are standing ready at the Maginot Line, defending the border of Belgium. While waiting on the Germans to reposition and drive east, Operation Weserübung is launched. Now, remember how we said Denmark would be invaded? Yeah, this is it. And at the same time, Norway, who claimed neutrality when Germany invaded Poland, is also invaded, right? So Denmark, Norway now. Now, the French and the British troops would land in Norway on a counteroffensive, but they would quickly be beaten. However, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, would take quite the beating there. They would have some issues, and we'll hear about that in a minute. In May, the Germans finally launched their attack on the French, hitting at multiple points in a full-on assault with what we like to call blitzkrieg. The French, the Belgian, and the British troops are crushed in a matter of days. Elements of Allied troops that were unable to get out of the grasp of the Germans were quickly entrapped in Flanders. Yep. For those of you saying, well, that sounds familiar, that would be the same Flanders mentioned in the poem from World War I, In Flanders Field. These men would have no other option than to surrender, while the ones who escaped were racing towards the coast trying to fight off the waves of German fighters hunting them down. By the 26th of May, the British troops were at the coastal city of Dunkirk. And it was here, while making a valiant last stand, that the British expeditionary forces would be kicked out of mainland Europe for the next 4 years. With the last British forces barely escaping, this is a fantastic time to point out the absolute tenacity of the British people during this time. When the British found out their boys were trapped on a beach in France with no way home, facing constant strafing from the Luftwaffe and pressure from an advancing German army, everyday folks, civilians who owned boats, raced across the English Channel in an armada to go get their boys. That is a telltale sign of what these people are capable of when the Battle of Britain begins. Anyway, on June 25th of 1940, the French collapsed and were officially defeated. Every single major ally that England had in Europe was now gone, all crushed in a matter of months from a war machine that seemed almost impossible to stop. There's a glimmer of hope. You see, once the Battle of France began, it was clear exactly how dangerous the situation was for England. This was not going to be a simple fight and one that would not touch their own soil. If the Prime Minister did not react accordingly, England could be facing an invasion next. It is at this time that Neville Chamberlain would be voted out of power by Parliament, and they decided to bring aboard someone who not only knew how to fight, but someone who wasn't afraid to dig in and get the fighting done himself. On May 10th, 1940, the King and Parliament would agree to induct Sir Winston Churchill as the United Kingdom's newest Prime Minister. And once the Battle of Dunkirk was concluded and France fell, it was clear to Churchill that the UK, they were next. This is where we hear probably one of the most badass speeches in history, right? England is at its breaking point by the summer of 1940. The fear surrounding the English facing the same fate as the remainder of Europe has sent the people into panic. Evacuations out of the city increase as more and more people are doing whatever they can to distance themselves not just from the war, but completely from Europe as a whole. In Churchill's speech, he states, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills, and we shall never surrender." There's more into that speech, but that's kind of what everyone remembers. This is a clear statement to his people and Adolf Hitler. You can come here if you wish, but you will never leave, and neither shall we. It is a defining moment for the British. War is coming here, and we aren't going to be just ready. We're going to fight these bastards back to the boats from which they came. The Battle of France did more than just a number on the Wehrmacht, too. They were able to beat the French, yes, rather quickly, but they took some substantial losses. On top of that, like I said, during the Nazis' little excursion into Norway, their navy got it too. Adolf Hitler could no longer use force in order to complete an amphibious landing large enough to take down the British. They would need to gain air supremacy first in order to gain the advantage to launch an armada across the English Channel. But the British were very, very aware, as I stated, they were the next target. But being off the mainland and on an island gave them an invaluable asset: time. Quickly, Prime Minister Churchill placed together a home front plan along with the war cabinet. The local defense volunteers formed by the fall of France, with over 1.5 million volunteers, were now standing in the home guard. And these were some people who were just down and dirty, ready to fight. They were armed with whatever they could find: their hunting rifles, their shotguns, golf clubs, knives, homemade explosives. They were putting bayonets on poles. These people were ready to go. By July, they were getting guns from the government, Lee Enfields, and they were also getting machine guns. The government was like, oh, it's going to go down, and you're going to be there with us. At the same time, the War Cabinet knew that the Royal Air Force was going to provide a pivotal role in the defense of England. The Royal Navy was going to build an impenetrable wall of ships to ward off any potential invasions. Stop lines were being formed all over the British coast with heavy, and I mean heavy, weapons prepared to break the German assault. Within these were thousands of anti-aircraft guns placed in every possible corner on coastal towns, preventing bombers from making it any further than the coast. The coastal defenses seemed to pop up seriously overnight, with coastal artillery, dragon's teeth, barbed wire, machine gun emplacements, tanks, everything else you could possibly think of in order to defend an island from an invasion. What I find most unique is that during this time, the British removed landmarks and street signs. I think that's brilliant. And here's why. If the Germans were to actually make it onto land and make a push in, their maps would be incorrect. They would have nothing to pinpoint and go off of any direction that they would want to go. It would be a guess. They'd look at a street and there's no street sign. How do you know that that's the street that you're on? They were going to make it as difficult as possible. Even then, the British moved anything that had gas or petrol or oil off out of the coastal cities, and they were pushed inland. Once again, their thinking is, well, if you're going to invade us, we're certainly not going to put all of our resources up front for you to nab within the first couple days. You're going to have to take this whole damn island to get enough resources. So we're going to make it hard. And that's exactly what they did. Churchill was so confident that the British were going to have this fight in their own backyard that he told his wife and his daughter-in-law that they be ready to kill one or two Germans before you yourself gets killed. This immortalized his phrase of, take one with you. And the British were surely ready for just that as they crept into July of 1940. So we're going to back up a month. In June, the commander of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, made it clear that the Luftwaffe's next objective would be to completely destroy the RAF in order to create a path of least resistance for the invasion of England, Operation Sea Lion, and that was marked for September of 1940. And on July 10th, the Luftwaffe bombers began hitting shipping ports in the south of England. On the 11th, the Luftwaffe began targeting industrial sites. So from July 10th through the 15th, there would be kind of like an initial nighttime bombing raids to weaken aerial defenses on the coast. They're hitting the furthest out, moving their way in. It makes sense. On the 16th, Hitler issues Directive Number 16, calling for the official preparation of Sea Lion. And within this, he demands that all RAF forces be decimated to allow the troops to land successfully in England. Hitler doesn't even want to view the prospect that he's going to have to deal with the RAF in Operation Sea Lion. Take them out beforehand, and then we'll launch Sea Lion. And that would basically become their mission from that point moving forward. And there are many air battles and the defense of the RAF that I'm going to speak about, but that's in the next episode. Sorry. However, speaking of next episodes, to wrap this episode up, we're going to fast forward a month. So by this point, the Battle of Britain is on. They are bombing England, and this is a bad situation for the British. But still, to this point, London has yet to be touched until September of 1940, and bombing raids have, like I said, been happening for 2 months. Blackouts begin to ensure that no lights will illuminate a city so bombers can't find them. Remember, America was the ones who brought forth daylight bombing missions, and that didn't happen for a couple more years. So at this point, everything's kind of done at night. Fast forward. But up until this point, London really hasn't been touched. There have been some close calls, but it seems like Hitler cannot quite get to London and really to show the British how vulnerable they really are. Hitler's plan, known to us as the Blitz, would be launched on September 7th, bombing the heart of England to destroy morale and the industrial might of the UK. And in the evening of September 6th, almost 1,000 aircraft would leave France on a direct path to London. And in the early hours, Londoners would be awoken by the distant humming of engines and the air raid alarms blaring and telling them to seek shelter, because the Germans had arrived. In our next episode, we are going to dive right into the Battle of Britain. We're going to dive into the Blitz. We're going to dive into the fight over London from the RAF's point of view. we're going to be discussing stories and memories from those that lived it. While it may not be considered the quote unquote true turning point of the war, the Battle of Britain proved that Germans 100% could be defeated. I look forward to the next episode as there is a lot, and I do mean a lot to cover. Like I said, this is more than likely going to be a super hefty series with 4, 5, maybe 6 episodes. So this episode was just get you up to speed where the world is at this time. The bombings have started and the Battle of Britain is on, and London has officially been hit. And we're going to give you a view of exactly how chaotic this moment was for the British. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this series or the podcast, make sure you leave us a like and review wherever you listen to the show. Make sure you head on over to all the socials and find us at World on Fire Podcast. We are now at over 300 subscribers, and I seriously cannot thank each and every single one of you. I know I look forward to these episodes every other week, and knowing folks out there listen to enjoying it certainly makes it a lot easier and makes my day. With that, thank you all so much. You enjoy your weekend, and for those Americans listening, you enjoy your 3-day weekend ahead. And I will see you all on March 1st.